everybody, and welcome to PTNI's Daily Show Fitness Athlete Friday. This Canadian is hoping that you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. And for all my Canadians who are listening to the podcast, I hope you had a wonderful Thursday. And so I loved seeing all the people doing gut check Thursday in preparation for Turkey Day. I thought that was really great. You know, kind of pay the man before you are getting into your Thanksgiving festivities. That is fantastic. If you guys don't know my affiliation with the Fitness Athlete team, I am lead faculty for clinical management of the fitness athlete pregnancy and postpartum. So it's an 8-week online course where we talk about how essentially to help your moms who are pregnant continue to be active and then help them transition back into things like CrossFit and barbell sports as they get further along into their postpartum period. So if you guys are interested in signing up for our next cohort, it starts January 14th. I'm teamed up with Kelsey Valentine, who's an internal pelvic floor therapist. This is not specifically for internal therapists, but we try and give you guys some insights into some of the things that are changing or some of the things that can happen in that postpartum period that we need to be aware of as clinicians. So I hope you guys, if you're interested, that you sign up for that cohort in the new year. Okay, so my topic for today is around discussing mental health with moms in their pregnant and postpartum period. I think this can be obviously universally stated, but there's a specific vulnerability for moms in the postpartum period in particular. And this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So giving a little bit of background, I have a fairly extensive family history of postpartum depression. I thankfully was not affected. But I have very close family members who have been hospitalized as a consequence of postpartum depression. And it was something because I know that there is, at least to some extent, a genetic link, was a consideration that for a period of time made me unwilling to have children and I thought that I wasn't going to have kids. And the reason for that is that my mental health was very important to me. And I was so terrified about what the changes may have happened to me in the postpartum period that I almost, when my husband and I started bringing up kids, I was initially against it. And that was because I just didn't want to take the risk, because I know that there's a lot of things that can circumvent and we can help with a diagnosis of postpartum depression, but it was not something that I was willing to sacrifice. Obviously, I changed my mind. My daughter is 7 months old. I'm 7 months postpartum, and knock on wood, I've been doing pretty good. But one of the things that really makes this a really important topic for me is that I flagged to my physician who was following my care through my pregnancy that I was terrified of postpartum depression, that it runs in my family. I really want you guys to be hyper vigilant on me because I'm also somebody who won't admit that something is wrong, even if it is. And so I asked them to put like 1 million flags in my chart so that when Maya, my daughter, was going for her first initial, checkups, especially 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and 8 weeks, to please really screen me for postpartum depression. Long story short, my family doctor, who was following my care, she was also specially trained in OBGYN, was pregnant at the same time. And so my care was transferred. And so she wasn't following up with me in my early postpartum period because she was also in her early postpartum period. And there was never any follow-up around how I was doing, how I was feeling emotionally, outside of, so how's it going? And the knee-jerk reaction is good. It's going great. I don't feel lost at all in this early postpartum period where my body doesn't feel normal and I'm trying to recalibrate everything and come to this huge life-altering state where I'm trying to now figure out how to be a mom. And I was actually really disappointed with that, and to the point where outside of that early postpartum period, I actually spoke with my physician and said, I was never asked any questions about postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety, and it would have been something that I probably would not have brought up to you because I'm fairly stoic and I don't necessarily, unless prompted, I probably wouldn't bring that up of my own volition. And so I was a little bit disappointed. And we had a really great conversation as a healthcare team to say, you know, that's probably something that I should have been way more diligent about, especially given your family history. And so it was a really great conversation, and I hoped that that conversation helped other moms. And so when I talk about this in the pregnancy and postpartum course, I talk about specifically asking about postpartum depression. And so there's different definitions for what postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety are. There's different timelines. I have notes with me to make sure that I'm being cognizant of the DSM criteria. But there's different criteria in regards to amount of time. At first, they used to say in the first 6 weeks postpartum, if you're experiencing any symptoms of being down for prolonged periods that extend over 2 weeks, where most days you're experiencing a sense of sadness or et cetera, and I'll list the symptoms. People are advocating for extending that definition so that instead of being 2 months, I think they're trying to extend it to either 6 months or 12 months, but that hasn't been reflected in the DSM manual, which is kind of the gold standard in regards to the criteria for any mental health conditions. But what that means is that oftentimes us as physical therapists can be one of the first points of contact, or a point of contact where you're getting a more prolonged interaction with a mom, where she may feel comfortable talking about some of the things that she's struggling with. And so the reason for the title of my talk today is don't just say, how are you doing? How are you doing creates a knee-jerk reaction. I prompt you to kind of delve a little bit deeper and ask, how is the baby sleeping? And not expecting that the baby is going to be sleeping through the night. How are you dealing with some of the sleep deprivation? Because increased amounts of sleep deprivation are a risk factor for the development of postpartum depression. How do you feel that you're handling it? Have you had periods of time where you feel sad? Have you had times where you feel like you're crying uncontrollably? In the early postpartum period, they talk about the postpartum blues and how it is a very common occurrence for women, especially as their milk comes in and they begin breastfeeding, for them to start experiencing dips in emotion. I know I had times where I was crying, but I was crying because I was like, oh my gosh, this baby is so beautiful. I don't know what's happening to me. Why are my emotions all over the place? And it was nice to have that little bit of a warning that was something that was going to be happening to me. And so then as that period kind of passed and I got further into my postpartum period, there were times where my emotions were fluctuating a lot. And it's not just postpartum depression. A lot of women that I'm seeing now, especially in the athletic population, it's the postpartum anxiety. So when we start talking about things like getting back to activity, there can be a certain amount of anxiety for a lot of moms around trying to get back to as much as possible as soon as possible. And it may seem like, these moms are just really gung-ho and they identify as being an athlete. That could be 100% true. But part of that motivation may be something much deeper. It can be that they feel gross about themselves. And you could be like, oh my gosh, you just had a baby. But it was emotions that I've had too, where I had a six-pack before I had a child. And that is not something that is my current reality. And so this change in body image was a huge driver for me because of my family history of postpartum depression. What people didn't know about one of my drivers to get back to activity really quickly is because I know the literature on exercise and depression. And I know that people who are physically active are significantly less likely to experience symptoms of depression and anxiety. And so for me, knowing that I had a family history and that was something that I was very worried about, getting back on a barbell earlier than potentially some people would, was something that was not just about my physical recovery, it was 100% about my mental recovery and what I felt I needed to do for my body in order for me to feel like I had a little bit of control. The other thing about that kind of sphere around body image is that people may feel like if they can get back to certain things that they are getting back to their quote unquote normal and what their body is feeling like. And having that cognitive dissonance where you're feeling like your body is not your own or things that were very natural for your body before, now you're being aware of. There's a lot of hypervigilance that can happen around the pelvic floor. All of these things can be contributing. And so what may on the surface seem like there is just, this desire to get back to athleticism may be so much deeper than that and be masking some things like postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety, that its output to the practitioner and in that interaction may be actually that it's just a really strong drive to get back to activity. And so if you just ask how you were doing and they say good, and then we start talking about their athletic journey, it may be that you're not getting the whole picture around what is happening. So let's talk a little bit about postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety. So postpartum depression has been studied a lot more in depth than postpartum anxiety. The one nice thing about postpartum depression diagnosis that doesn't necessarily exist for postpartum anxiety is that there is an outcome measure that is, I believe it's 12 questions, which you can put into your initial paperwork that essentially screens for degrees of worry, essentially, on the side of the practitioner for how a mom is doing. So it goes from how do you feel you're coping to anything around potential suicide risk, which is a huge red flag and something that we might not really be on our radar. But some of the statistics are pretty staggering, and that suicide secondary to postpartum depression accounts for 20% of all maternal deaths. And that, to me, like 1 in 5 maternal deaths is related to suicide, is a pretty staggering statistic, and something that I was really cognizant of as I was going through the course and really making sure that I put an emphasis on not only talking about the physical dimension of recovery, but some of the mental health dimension as well. So when we're thinking about depression diagnosis in the postpartum period, you are experiencing the presence of 5 or more of the following. I'm going to list these to make sure that I don't get them wrong. So depressed mood, diminished interest or pleasure in activities, change in body weight that's more than 5% in a month. That's not really going to be as aware, that's obviously going to flux when you're in that postpartum period. Insomnia, psychomotor agitation or retardation, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. That is a huge one for postpartum depression. So that feeling that you're not being a good mom, that you aren't doing this right, everything is that this should be more natural to you. Breastfeeding should come natural. Like, I can't believe I can't do it. Why is my body not able to do what it's supposed to do? All of these feelings. Decreased ability to concentrate and recurrent thoughts of death or suicidal ideation. My baby would be better off without me, which is where the red flag comes in. The hard thing about this diagnosis of major depression and postpartum depression, and why it can so often be missed, is that sometimes these feelings are fairly natural things that happen in the early postpartum period, like not sleeping very well. That feeling of fatigue or loss of energy. Like, I felt like I was fatigued for 6 months. My daughter is just starting to sleep through the night. And so those types of diagnostic criteria can be really tough because it's considered normal or a natural part of going into that early postpartum period. It's usually, symptoms are starting in postpartum depressions within 4 weeks of delivery. And so it's somewhat controversial, but they're trying to increase it to 6 months. And the reason why they think that women can be particularly prone to things like postpartum depression is this change of flux in your hormone levels. When you are lactating, your estrogen levels are decreased. And so that may have, what we know is that estrogen can be protective, and therefore it may be leading to this estrogen may have an antidepressant effect, and so that lack of estrogen may make you a little bit more vulnerable. So also, if you're having difficulties with certain transitions in stage, so if you're having difficulties with lactation or breastfeeding, the increased risk of postpartum depression goes up. And so there's a lot of women who are, or if they're having this cognitive dissonance around their birth story. So if they thought that they were going to be not need an epidural, and they caved and had an epidural, which is obviously totally fine, but in their mind it may not be. If they thought they were going to have a vaginal delivery and they ended up in a C-section, some of these things, these cognitive dissonance on top of a drop in estrogen level, potential problems with breastfeeding or lactation and sleep deprivation can all kind of create this perfect storm where postpartum depression may be a little bit more, people may be a little bit more prone to postpartum depression. The other thing is that postpartum depression does not only happen to women. Men can also be experiencing postpartum depression, which also makes us very aware that it is not just the hormone changes that are leading to this vulnerability. I have treated a lot of women who have struggled because their husbands have gone through a period of postpartum depression after the birth of their first, second, or third child. And therefore, there's a lot of conversations around how to cope with a spouse who is suffering with mental health issues. And again, for the postpartum athlete, it may be that, that hour that they have to exercise is the only chance that they have to essentially release some of that tension or release some of that very high stress energy that they may be experiencing through a good portion of their day. The other thing that can happen is that sometimes we don't get back to exercise, and it can create this dampened mood or this depressed mood because you thought that you would be getting back to exercise after 6 weeks and you would be going full steam ahead, and then that just isn't necessarily the case, and it isn't what happens because of whatever the case may be, prolapse or incontinence or just not feeling strong or supported in your pelvic floor or abdominal wall. All right, so clinical application. One is postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety is probably more common than you think. I think in an athletic population, this population in particular is very used to being stoic and pushing their bodies. And so sometimes they may not be the first group that you may think, one, would be susceptible to postpartum anxiety and depression, and two, may not be the first to really come forward and say that they are struggling. So as a clinician, if you are working with a mom in the postpartum period, go beyond how are you doing? Ask about mood. If you don't feel comfortable, print off that outcome measure, put it into your paperwork, and sometimes do it every single time they come in, especially if you're seeing them between 6 weeks and 6 months postpartum. It is very quick, the change in mental health status that can happen. Your child can have a period of 5 or 6 days where they're just not sleeping, and that can be enough to trigger a mom to go and spiral into some of those postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety symptoms. Symptoms have to be persistent for more than 2 weeks. So if you are seeing them on a semi-regular basis, then it may be something that you want to be keeping an eye on, especially if there are any, yellow flags that are coming up. And because that trust and that therapeutic alliance is there, you may be the practitioner that will, allow them to have a space to talk, or would be the one that they would be most open to hearing, maybe it's time for you to talk to your doctor about this, or let's try and link you with some resources for counseling or other resources in the community that may help you feel a little bit better. Alrighty, that is my topic for today. I hope you guys found that helpful. I know that we talk a lot about physical health, but I feel like mental health is so important. And as practitioners that get to spend quite a bit of time with some of our moms, our postpartum athletes, I think that we have a huge role to play, and we can definitely be a help, even if it's just to make that referral and have someone that you trust be there to help you with that transition. Alrighty. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Thanksgiving weekend. I will see you guys next week. I'm actually going to change hats and talk a little bit about business next Thursday on the Leadership Thursday segment. So I will see you next week. Sometimes I'm every 2 weeks, but I will see you next week on Thursday. And I hope you guys, are enjoying your Thanksgiving weekend, and that you are, feeling that good amount of bloat from a big meal with family and friends. All right. Bye, guys.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.